It was the first day of 1963, the 1st of January, when two teenagers were searching for golf balls near Fuller's Bridge in Chatswood West, Sydney, Australia. The bridge crosses the Lane Cove River, and on the shoreline the teenagers spotted a man lying face down, body covered with a suit jacket. At first they didn't assume anything untoward had happened. It was New Year's Day. They just kind of assumed the man was drunk and asleep, and they continued about their morning. It was only when they returned about an hour later and the man still hadn't moved a muscle that they took a closer look and realised his face had turned blue. They ran to get help. This is one of Australia's most baffling unsolved mysteries, a story which involved rumours of spies in the height of the Cold War, rumours of physicists working for the government, conspiracy theories and public mistrust. But was it a lot simpler than that? Who was responsible for the death of this man and the woman that was also found nearby? Or was anyone even responsible at all? Nowadays, a lot of people do consider this to be a solved case. A filmmaker finally found some plausible answers, but a modern day inquest has never taken place to confirm his findings. Many people do have questions though, so let's explore the story together and see what we think. After the teenagers made the report of the body, police soon arrived at the scene and they started to investigate. And they found just a very, very odd situation. At first glance, it almost looked like this man was fully dressed up in a suit, but upon closer look, it looked like somebody had simply placed the suit jacket and the trousers perfectly over the top of the body. It was all just very odd. And then a constable taking a look around the area alerted that he'd found another body, this time that of a woman lying face up about 15 metres away. She was found in this sort of like small dip much closer to the edge of the river. Her body had been entirely covered with ripped up cardboard boxes that had previously housed beer. And just like the man, she was also in a state of undress. She was naked on top, her bra pulled down, and she was still wearing a skirt, but it was all kind of bunched up around her waist. Her underpants were found just a little bit away, whilst a pair of men's underwear were by her feet. Now, you'd probably be forgiven for thinking this was some sort of sexual assault, a violent death. But strangely, that didn't seem to be the case at all. There were no signs of violence here, no marks or bruises on the bodies, no sign of a struggle. This area was known for being somewhat of a lover's lane. People would often sneak away to this point to have their fun, even if it was just a bit smelly and a bit dirty. It was right next to the river. But no, from a cursory overview of this scene, it seemed like everything that had gone on here was definitely consensual. But there was one very interesting clue found at the scene. The bodies were surrounded by vomit and human excrement. Something had clearly happened. Had they eaten something bad? Had they ingested some kind of poison? It was clear they had died very, very quickly. But how and why? Why had somebody poisoned them? Why would anybody want these people dead? Had anyone even poisoned them? If nobody had poisoned them, had they poisoned themselves? The couple was soon identified as Dr Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler, a pair who'd been hanging out at a New Year's Eve party the night before. So let's do a bit of background on both of them. Gilbert Stanley Bogle was born on the 5th of January 1924 in Wanganui, New Zealand. It was clear from a young age that he had a brilliant mind. He was a talented musician and linguist, and he was great at physics, which he eventually studied at Victoria University College in Wellington. It was so clear that he was going to go really far in life, but something scary was looming on the horizon, and that was World War II. In 1945, Gilbert became eligible to serve in the war, of which New Zealand was involved for all but 3 of the 2,179 days, on the side, of course, of the Allies. Gilbert was apparently terrified of being drafted into the war. He knew it was only a matter of time, but he just really, really didn't want to do it. But his brain saved him. A professor at his university informed him that the greatest minds were being spared because they could help more with the war effort from home. At the end of the day, World War II was going to be won by intelligence, by strategy, rather than by fighting and manpower. So the university put in a good word for him and Gilbert was saved from the draft. He was allowed to work as an assistant in the lab and extend his honours course for a further 2 years, and he was able to do this without any of the social stigma of dodging the draft. And his brain really did take him far in life. In 1947, he received a scholarship and made the journey over here to England to study at Oriel College at Oxford University. He worked there for 2 years on a very clever sounding project, paramagnetic resonance experiments at very low temperatures, if anyone knows what that means, and he published a lot of articles surrounding it. Like I said, a clever guy. Whilst here in the UK, he meets a woman called Vivian Rich, or maybe he already knew her from home, I'm not entirely sure, but he married her in Essex in September 1950. She was also from New Zealand. She graduated from Victoria College University as well, so I do suspect they probably already knew each other from New Zealand and just connected or reconnected in England. And within just a couple of years, they were back in New Zealand and they would go on to have 4 children together. Around 1955, Gilbert applied for the role of Senior Research Officer at the National Standards Lab in Sydney, under the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. He got the role, of course, because he was super smart, and the family just up and moved again. Not quite as far this time, just across to Sydney, Australia. Gilbert was said to be noteworthy for his mental powers, his breadth of knowledge, his capacity for original ideas, his drive and enthusiasm, his range of experimental techniques, and his outstanding ability as a lecturer. And he was encouraged to keep working on his research on paramagnetic resonance. Apparently, all types of people all around the world were very interested in this work and what could potentially come from this. In fact, he drew so much attention that he was even offered a role in the USA in a New Jersey lab where he was to work on quantum electronics. This was to be a 2-year contract and the family were actually going to leave for the USA in the next few months. But of course, Gilbert would never make it. On the 21st of December 1962, he went to a Christmas party where he met a woman called Margaret Chandler and they immediately hit it off. Margaret was born as Margaret Morfitt on the 2nd of April 1924 in New South Wales. I couldn't find quite as much of a background on her, but she trained as a nurse as an adult and on Christmas Eve 1957 married Geoffrey Chandler, who was a scientific photographer at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, which is the same company under which Gilbert Bogle also worked. Although it wasn't outright stated anywhere as far as I could see, we can only assume the Christmas party at which the pair met was something to do with the company, whether it was a colleagues or a work party, don't really know, but something to do with Bogle and Chandler's company. Now you might think all of this is very scandalous, these married people meeting at a party and hitting it off, and perhaps that was the case for Gilbert, but some very important context to note is that Margaret and Geoffrey had an open marriage, and honestly, I love that for them. This is 1962-63, the Western world is on the brink of the free love movement, and this was incredibly progressive for this time. Some might say it's progressive even for today, but I say as long as there is open communication there, as long as everyone is consenting to said open marriage, go for it, live your best life, sex is sex. And it seems like Margaret and Geoffrey were both in agreement that as long as they both came home to each other at the end of the day, nothing else mattered. They could sleep with who they wanted. So when Margaret met Gilbert, who was known as Gib to his friends, at this party and mentioned her interest in him to her husband, Geoffrey is reported as saying, if you want to have Gib as a lover, if it would make you happy, do it. And as a colleague, Geoffrey probably knew that Gilbert was about to go over to the USA for 2 years, so it was no skin off his back. As for Gilbert and Vivian though, I don't think their relationship was necessarily open, but it was well known to everyone who knew them that he openly cheated on his wife. I think it might have been a kind of don't ask, don't tell kind of situation. He was a very charming and effervescent man, and he had multiple affairs whilst no doubt his poor wife was left at home caring for their kids. At this time, sort of New Year's Eve 1962-63, she was heavily pregnant with their 4th child, who he would never meet. So when Gilbert and Margaret met at the Christmas party, they immediately hit it off, and Margaret was very intrigued by this man. And then 2 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, they find themselves at the same party once again. Some sources suggest that Gilbert was so enamoured with Margaret, they actually made sure that he was at the same party as her. Like, this wasn't a coincidence, which is something I think we've all done when we have a crush on someone. This party was definitely that of another work colleague at their home in Chatswood, which is a suburb in North Sydney. Margaret and Gilbert spent the night flirting, and at around 11:30pm, Jeffrey left to go and buy some cigarettes, but he ended up going on a bit of an adventure and found himself at a party in Balmain, which is kind of a more inner city suburb. I didn't look up how to pronounce that, sorry. And this wasn't a coincidence. One of Jeffrey's own lovers, a woman called Pam, was at this party in Balmain, so he spent midnight with her before returning to the Chatswood party at around 2:30am. But when he got back to Chatswood, it was very clear his wife only had eyes for Gilbert. All good, they were open, it was fine, but Jeffrey did have some words with Gilbert to ensure that he kept his wife safe, that he got her home. And in agreement, it seems, Jeffrey said that he would go back to Pam in Balmain and he would leave their home empty for the night if the new couple wanted to go back there together. At around 4:30am, maybe a little bit before, Gilbert and Margaret left the party together. Although they did try to hide what they were up to. Gilbert, like I said, was in a monogamous marriage at the end of the day. And although Jeffrey and Margaret were open, this kind of relationship would have been very scandalous in Sydney at the time. They didn't want to advertise it. But it seems they didn't choose to go back to Margaret's house for whatever reason. Instead, they went to the part of the riverbank by the bridge and decided to do the deed there. Maybe they were just feeling a bit adventurous, maybe they wanted to do something crazy, maybe Gilbert didn't feel comfortable going to the house, I don't really know. This part of the story has always been a mystery to everyone, like why did they not just go back to the house and they would have still been alive today? Maybe. 1963, maybe not. Meanwhile, Jeffrey headed to Pam's house, but she was asleep, of course, because it was 4:30 in the morning, and he woke her up. His and Margaret's children had been at Margaret's parents' house and they were supposed to pick them up after the party, so he goes to do just that, despite it being so late/early, I suppose. But he knew that he couldn't take them home as he'd promised Margaret the house, so they all went back to Pam's for the morning. I really don't know how they explained this to the kids, if they were just like, oh, this is one of Daddy's friends. I don't know. It's a weird dynamic. At around 10am, he decided it probably was safe to go home, so packed up the kids and headed back, only to find that Margaret wasn't there. He wasn't super concerned though, perhaps she decided to go elsewhere with Gilbert and was still asleep, so he decided to catch up on some sleep himself. I have no idea what his kids were doing in this time, they were just 9 months old and 2 years old though, so perhaps he put them to bed himself. But then he was woken up at 1pm with a knock at the door, opening it to see police standing there, and they said they needed to take him to Chatsworth Police Station, which is where he was informed of his wife's death and he was interviewed. Because of course, Jeffrey was immediately number one suspect in her death and the death of her lover. A wife cheating on her husband with one of his colleagues, like obviously Jeffrey had murdered the pair in jealousy. There were no questions in the police's minds that he was responsible, but the big question was, how did he do it? Even after being told that the pair had an open relationship, that Jeffrey had fully consented for his wife to go off with this other man, this was, at the end of the day, 1960s conservative Australia. Most people were just not going to be able to wrap their heads around a relationship like this. I mean, like I said earlier, most people today wouldn't be able to wrap their heads around this. In certain circles, it's definitely more common, but as a general rule, open relationships, like non-monogamy, is a no. So Jeffrey sat in the police station being questioned by the police after being presented with a news article all about the deaths. I think that's how he was told. He was just like shown a news article. And apparently he just froze. Actually, at this point, I should probably talk about my number one source for this episode, and that's a man called Peter Butt. Peter Butt is an Australian film producer, director and writer who produces investigative documentaries for TV. I will never be able to say investigative. 8 years doing true crime on YouTube and I still can't say it. But anyway, one of his most famous documentaries was 2006's Who Killed Dr Bogle and Mrs Chandler. This was the ABC's most watched documentary ever. And in making this documentary, it took over Peter's life. He spent years researching every single angle of this story. He knows more about it than anyone else. And a lot of my sources for this episode are just interviews with Peter, including Brielle Burns' Mamma Mia article about the case and the podcast True Crime Conversations, which is also by Mamma Mia. They have just so much great information here. Peter also has his own podcast called Who Killed Dr Chandler and Mrs Bogle, and I would highly recommend you go and listen to it if you want more information about this case. He is the person who's come up with the closest thing to an answer that this story is probably ever going to get, but we'll get there in a bit. Basically, all to say, he is my number one source for this video, for this episode. Anyway, back to Jeffrey. He's at the police station, he's in shock, he's being questioned as to his wife's death, and the interviewing officers are refusing to take no as an answer. Apparently, Jeffrey just froze, and despite the police trying to force him into admitting guilt, he just didn't, because he didn't do anything. He couldn't tell them anything because he didn't know anything. And besides, Jeffrey had an alibi. He was with Pam at the time. He'd gone to pick up his children. He couldn't have been murdering his wife and her lover at the same time as doing all this. And eventually the police did have to let him go, but it's very much a case of like, we're on to you, we're going to get you, like we know you did this, you might not have admitted to it, but we're going to find out that you did it. As you can probably imagine, this was a case that was picked up hugely by the Australian media. I mean, of course it would be. It has the perfect level of scandal. It was an affair, in quotation marks. The deaths were very mysterious. This story sold a lot of papers. And despite Jeffrey stating time and time again that they had an open marriage, people just couldn't wrap their heads around it. He had a lot of heat on him. Even though the police let him go, a lot of the general public was still convinced that he had to have done it. No matter how much Jeffrey said it was fine, he was chill with his wife sleeping with other people, the general public just couldn't wrap their heads around it. And if they did, it just kind of villainised him more, because that's very strange behaviour. Like, who would let their wife sleep with somebody else? There must be something wrong with him. But there was nothing on Jeffrey, of course, because like I said, he didn't do it. So the police had to make several public appeals for information, for anyone who had perhaps been passing around this area at the time, for anyone who had maybe seen anything. And one person that came to their attention was a greyhound trainer called Eddie Batiste, who was known to take his dogs to the river early every single morning for a run. And Eddie likely would have been there at the same time that Margaret and Gilbert were. An investigation did prove that his car had been there at the time. But Eddie was kind of just your bog standard guy. He didn't know the couple, he wouldn't have had any motive to kill them, he didn't really have a criminal past. Like, sure, he might have been there at this time, but there was no evidence to say he'd done anything untoward to them. But it was thought in a weird way that Eddie was involved. A very big question since the moment the bodies were discovered was who on earth had covered the bodies. Remember, Gilbert was found with his suit perfectly laid over the back of his naked body, and Margaret was covered with ripped up beer boxes. It made sense that whoever had killed them had covered their bodies, but also it wasn't that clear that they had been murdered. They didn't know for sure that this was a case of murder. Peter Butt has since spoken to family members of Eddie, who has since passed, and they do believe that he was definitely at the scene. Family members believe that Eddie saw the bodies, perhaps just assuming they were drunk and passed out like the teenage boys had. Remember, this was New Year's Day, like the early hours of New Year's Day, lots of people were drunk. And Eddie was very much a man of the time. He was horrified by indecency and the naked body. He was very much a prude. So maybe, just assuming they were drunk, he made an effort to cover them up. He didn't call the police, he didn't report what he'd seen, so maybe he really did genuinely think they were just passed out drunk. Or maybe he knew they were bodies but was in denial. It makes sense to those who knew him that Eddie would do such a thing, that he would see these bodies naked and would make an effort to cover them. But here's the thing, it wasn't murder. Apparently Eddie himself had almost died in pretty much this exact spot of the river in a boating accident as a kid, so maybe all of this just brought back bad memories for him and he just sort of like went on autopilot, did what he could and then never mentioned it to anyone. Apparently when he got home he was very anxious and very stressed about something and his family could never quite figure out why, like what was going on. It could also be that Eddie made a bad decision at the scene that day when maybe he found Margaret's handbag. Her bag was later found emptied of all valuables and was dumped in a bush, later to be found by schoolgirls. Maybe Eddie found her bag, went through it, took some bits, dumped it, and then when stories of dead bodies being found came out, he just couldn't bring himself to admit any part in it. This is all speculation, but very carefully pieced together speculation. Eddie's family did say that on that day he came home from his morning walk incredibly anxious and out of sorts. He was very, very stressed. So nobody's ever thought really that Eddie killed them, but they definitely think he had some part to play in the very strange scene. I suppose at this point I should probably talk about the autopsy, shouldn't I? Well, the initial autopsy didn't provide any answers whatsoever. It was very clear that something had caused their hearts to stop. They both died in the exact same way, but there were no clues as to what exactly had caused this. As expected from the scene, the autopsy showed no signs of violence at all, apart from some very strange purple-coloured patches on the skin. In the absence of everything else, it was concluded that their causes of death were a rapidly acting poison, even though forensic examination failed to find any traces of toxic materials. There was no arsenic, no carbon monoxide, no recreational drugs, but it was kind of the only theory that made sense. In 1963, the idea of forensic science as we know it today just didn't really exist, especially in a small, quiet suburb of Sydney, Australia. There were no team who went and carefully collected evidence, analysed in a lab somewhere. Instead, it was just a case of like, oh, there's evidence at the scene, let's just pick it up and put it in a box and then just store it away somewhere. Like, there was no testing, there was no DNA analysis, like that was kind of it. What could be analysed was sent to a toxicologist who looked at the evidence for every possible poison that he could think of. He contacted experts all around the world, and there was just nothing that could explain the symptoms suffered by Margaret and Gilbert that day. This toxicologist spent 13 months on this case. It took over his entire life, but he just couldn't find an answer. According to Peter, he actually had to quit after this because it took such a deep toll on him. There would eventually be a very long coronial inquest in May 1963, but no cause of death was ever found, nor was any killer or even a motive. This was the mystery of the century, as the police commissioner said. For the first time, it was mentioned at the inquest that sperm had been found on Gilbert's coat, which did suggest sexual activity. Again, conservative Sydney, this fact wasn't broadcast in the newspapers. But as Peter Butt points out in the True Crime Conversations podcast, this is a very important point because it suggests that the pair weren't feeling ill when they first arrived at the river. Or certainly it suggests they at least felt well enough to actively partake in sexual activity. They were in the throes of passion when the poison, or whatever it was, overtook them and they suddenly died. Something comes over them, they walk away from each other feeling ill, walking in different directions, probably stumbling, swaying, vomiting, and they don't have any time to make themselves decent, to put their clothes back on. Peter says that it seems like Gilbert was literally dragging his feet, he could barely walk. Evidence shows that they were having sex on the sort of very bank of the river. They were sort of down in this little hidden shallow by the shoreline, and Gilbert did manage to make his way back up out of this and away from the river. But Margaret couldn't even do that. She died in this shallow. From when they first started feeling ill to when they died, it was probably a matter of minutes, seconds maybe even. Like, it didn't take long at all. Poison was evident, but as we've already covered, they were never able to find out what that poison was. Like, it was still a complete mystery. Now, if you're anything like me, you'll probably be thinking, poison? That's a woman's weapon. Women are found to use poison to kill or injure people a lot more often than men are. And this made investigators look at all sorts of women involved in this story. There was Gilbert's slighted wife Vivian, Jeffrey's lover Pam, other lovers that Gilbert had taken over the years, but everyone had an alibi. All sorts of theories flew about what could have happened. Had somebody maybe spiked their drinks at the party, maybe thinking it was some kind of joke? But why would somebody do that, and why would it take so long to act? And if they had done that, what had they been poisoned with? Because it wasn't any normal spiking poison. Like any poison known to your standard person would have shown up in the toxicology testing, and there was nothing, apart from the fact, of course, that these were all scientists at this party. Maybe they knew something that toxicologists didn't, but still, it just never really went anywhere. The police did call in a team to search the river for any evidence. They were looking for potential syringes, drug bottles, etc. But the team apparently turned up and then refused to get in the water because it was so polluted. It was so disgusting. They said they wouldn't be able to see anything anyway, and besides, they weren't risking their lives by getting in this water. 11 days later, the river had cleared up a little bit, like whatever was in it had passed, so they did eventually get in and do the search, but still visibility wasn't great, and they didn't find anything. Ever since the 1890s, a local flour mill had been pumping millions of litres of waste into this water, and it all seemed to gather in this 1/4 mile of it, which just so happened to be exactly where Gilbert and Margaret were discovered. This was truly a gross portion of water. Like, you did not want to get in this, you didn't want to be around it, it was stinky, it was gross. Like, why it was lovers laying around the area, I do not know. Maybe because random people didn't go there and hang around because it was so smelly, like people weren't going to get caught. Months and months passed and answers were nowhere to be found. Different theories showed up in the papers every single day, and this got so bad that many of the people involved in the story literally upped and left the country. They were being hounded, they couldn't just get on with their lives. These people simply became fodder for the newspapers, characters in the story. Their pasts were dredged up for everyone to see. In the end, Vivian Bogle took their now 4 kids and went back to New Zealand. Pam, Jeffrey's lover, moved to Canada. It seems Jeffrey himself did stick around, but said that his and his kids' lives were hugely affected by this. It was just really rough for everyone. People were being accused of murder left, right and centre, despite the inquest not being able to find any evidence of such. But like, it had to be murder, right? Like, somebody had to be responsible for this. One of the biggest theories in this case, the one that you'll find at the top of all the articles, makes references to Gilbert's job. The context of the time here is really important because this is 1963, it's the height of the Cold War, everyone is worried about nuclear bombs being dropped. Australia as a country wasn't quite as involved in the Cold War drama as the rest of the world, like they're a bit removed from it, and they didn't have the biggest political part to play, but they were still there, they'd still fought as part of the Allies. In the early 1950s, they had signed a formal alliance with the United States, so eyes would have been on them. And Gilbert Bogle was on the precipice of moving to the USA to work on very complicated physics stuff. So could he have had a target on his back? Was he maybe going to be working in the nuclear field with people trying to cover things up, saying he was working in quantum electronics, when really he was going to do something nuclear? Was his work about to potentially bring some things to light? Now, any case I talk about in the Western world in this time is rife with theories of hits, CIA, KBG, spies and espionage. Was Gilbert working as a spy? Had he been the victim of nerve gas and Margaret was just a sad victim who just so happened to be there when it happened? These theories sound interesting and they're good to sell papers. But there's no evidence that Gilbert was involved in anything untoward. He was just a smart guy who was wanted by labs all around the world. He wasn't a spy, he wasn't working for the enemy, his papers weren't about to change the world. He was just a smart physics guy. What if I tell you that the true answer here, or at least the answer which has been accepted for the most part today, is much, much more boring than that? What if it was just nature? No murder, no sinister plots, just wrong place at the wrong time, and a weird natural phenomenon. This theory is one which Peter Buck came to in making his 2006 documentary about this case, and although it definitely has its critics, it's been the closest anyone has ever been to a true answer in this case. I'm not telling you this is 100% what happened, this is still technically an unsolved case and there are no tissue samples of Gilbert and Margaret left to test today, so it likely will forever remain unsolved, but this might be the closest we get. Peter has suggested that these deaths were caused by asphyxiation caused by hydrogen sulfide poisoning from the highly polluted river. Looking through local records, he found there was a whole history of hydrogen sulfide emanating out of the mud on the riverbanks. So much so that in the 1940s, there was this whole thing where residents in the homes nearest the river literally couldn't breathe at night and they were going to have to be evacuated. At the time, they called in the Maritime Services Board and found out that the river bottom was saturated in this gas, which is said to be just as toxic as cyanide gas. Peter said it's heavier than air and in the cool of the morning, it hovers basically at ground level. If you find yourself lying in that for a prolonged period of time, like if you are having sex on the riverbank, it could asphyxiate you and you could die. It's super rare, but it is possible and it does happen. 20 years earlier, people had been suffocating in their homes because of this, and they weren't literally lying on the riverbed on the mud from which the gas was emanating. Hydrogen sulfide wouldn't show up in the testing because, well, you couldn't really test for it. The only symptom of this type of poisoning is purple blood. Your blood literally turns purple. And Margaret and Gilbert were said to have been found with purple splotches all over their body where their blood had pooled. Peter Butt also later spoke to the medical examiner, I think. At this point in the video, I am very much just freeballing it because I seem to have deleted the notes for like my outro of this video, so I'm pretty sure Peter Butt spoke to the medical examiner, or at least one of the people who was there, and he confirmed that their blood was indeed purple. And apparently he never mentioned it at the inquest because he just thought it was kind of like inconsequential, like it didn't really matter, but with this new evidence having come to light, it is quite important, it turns out. So yeah, Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler, the people at the centre of Australia's greatest unsolved mystery, they weren't part of some CIA plot, they weren't spies or involved in espionage, they weren't murdered by a jilted lover. They were probably just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was it. Of course, like I said earlier, we don't know for sure that this theory is 100% correct. It's a very, very, very good theory, but it doesn't mean the case is solved. There's no tissue samples left to test. There's no way to know if this was truly the case. But considering the time, the place, the situation they were in, low to the ground, it all adds up. Investigators here spent so much time looking for a murderer, questioning all the people involved in their lives. The media destroyed the lives of all the people involved in this story, and it turns out it was just nature. It was just pollution. It was pollution that caused this. A local flour mill pumping all of their rubbish into the river, along with everyone else also dumping a load of rubbish into the river. And this is what it resulted in. Potentially, maybe. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I found this case so interesting to research. I was fully immersed in this one. So if you know of any other similar cases, similar stories I can also delve into, please let me know. Leave them in the comments down below. Or if you don't know of any similar stories, leave a comment anyway. It really helps this channel. Every interaction with a video on YouTube tells the YouTube algorithm that people like this and maybe they should push it out to more people, and it really helps. So like, comment, subscribe to this channel if you want to. Like I always say, I see loads of you are watching these, you come back every week and you're not subscribing. Why are you not subscribing? You probably should do. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.